All right, then I guess let's start. I am experiencing slight technical difficulties. I am not seeing anything on my screen, so I have to turn away from you rather constantly. I'm sorry about that, and first time we film, so there you go. Here's what we're going to do today. There will be an extended session on where I'm going to define and lay out important terms and definitions to you, and we'll then summarize that. That's all we are going to do today. In between, there's slight computations going on, but basically, this is all about definitions of terms. So where to begin? This is a lecture on game AI. Last time we saw that there is a venerable history. It goes back until the 1940s. And there is lots of disciplines that have been contributing to the area of artificial intelligence for game applications. We saw, for instance, fields like game theory, mathematical game theory, control theory, and the like. So where to begin? Right? And to start this lecture off, I thought, well, let's start at the beginning, like where the history of game AI started. And the history, as we will see, began with ideas about how to play games like chess. And then people started to define, well, what constitutes a game? And they began to recognize that there are several characteristics that probably need definition or need explanation. And here's the first. A complete information, in parentheses, game, is a situation where knowledge about other players is available to all players. Every player knows payoffs, whatever that is, and strategies, whatever that is, available to the other players. This is called the situation of complete information. Well, if there is a situation of complete information, that suggests that there might also be a situation of incomplete information, right? Sort of the opposite. What could that be?
One of the conditions is violated here.
Is pardon?
One of the conditions is violated here.
Yeah. So an incomplete information game or incomplete information refers to a situation in which a player may not know everything about other players, right? May not know their strategies, may not know about possible payoffs or preferences. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah. This is real life, right? In real life, we constantly face situations where we first have to learn about the situation we're in. When you came here to study, that may have been a new situation for each and everybody, right? So you first had to get used to sort of what kind of rules, what kind of mechanisms do apply here at this university, what kind of conventions are there for everyday life. And they may have been different than where you come from. Right? So incomplete information is actually what we know from daily life. That is, of course, if we want to formalize, mathematically formalize the idea of gameplay, then we all know everyday life is complicated, and this might be asking a bit too much at the beginning. Right? And this is exactly the situation. So people, when they started out studying games from a mathematical or computer scientific point of view, they focus on this situation, on complete information. Now, and there we have the notion of a perfect information game. Right? A perfect information game is a situation, or refers to a game in which a player has all the relevant information to make a decision. Everything that needs to be known in order to come up with an informed decision is indeed known. Do you know games of that type? Chess is the canonical example. Everything you need to know is clearly laid out in front of you. You cannot look inside the heads of your opponents, but the situation that describes the game state is clearly visible to you. You know everything. Well, if there are perfect information games, that suggests that there's also sort of the opposite. What could that be?
Poker.
Poker is a good example.
Monopoly.
Pardon?
Monopoly.
Yeah, this would be games where, you know, some of the information is hidden from you because a player is holding a set of cards, having a hand, and you cannot see the hand of your opponent or your opponents. There may also be elements of chance in there, right? If you have to roll a dice to make a move. These are situations where we're talking about imperfect information games. The different players of the game have different information available to them. This may sound funny, but perfect and imperfect information games are complete. Again, what is that to say that they are complete information games? The players know the rules, right? They don't have to figure out the rules why they play. So even though we are talking about imperfect information, still every participant of the game knows at least what the game is about, what rules to apply, what is legal, what is not. Perfect information game can, like now with respect to a game, right? Not just, you know, the situation of perfect information. In the context of games, we can say that, well, a perfect information game is such that the player actually sees everything that is necessary in order to make a move and has all the information as to what happened prior to the current situation. Nothing is hidden. Here are examples. These are all classical two-player games, checkers, chess, Go. These are perfect information games. Everything you need to know about the game is clearly visible in front of you, and in order to decide for a move, well, you see everything you need to know. And again, like this idea of imperfect information with respect to games is such that an imperfect information game is a game where players may be unaware of the situation of the other player, holding some cards in their hands and maybe rolling a dice. Battleship. This is Battleship. You know Battleship? Like this game where you have to, I don't know, sink ships. This is an imperfect information game. You just really don't know where the ships of your opponent are located, and sort of while playing the game, that information becomes available to you eventually one step at a time. And of course, poker. We don't know the hands of the other players. A turn-based game is a game where players take turns while playing. I make a move, you make a move, I make a move, you make a move. Or I make a move, you make a move, you make a move, you make a move, you make a move, I make a move. You know, it's turn-based. Obviously, sort of, these are examples maybe everybody knows. This is backgammon. These are both games where there are elements of chance involved in it. So in a sense, imperfect information games because we don't really know everything to make a move prior to rolling the dice. But they are turn-based. This is a two-player turn-based game. This is actually a multiplayer turn-based game. Do you know this game? Okay. How is it called in your language? In German it's Mensch ärgert mich. In English I guess it's Pachisi, for whatever reason. But these are turn-based games. The opposite would be a simultaneous game, right? When every player makes their move simultaneously. What could be examples of that? Well, sure, games like serious sport games, yes, definitely. Rock, paper, scissors is such a game, right? Players have to move at the same time. Well, but then of course all the sort of modern computer games we so much love. This is an example from a first-person shooter game. This is like cricket, right? You move through some environment, you have some goal, other people have another goal, and while in that environment, say while on the playing field, everybody does something constantly, simultaneously. And this is a real-time strategy game. These types of games started out as turn-based games back in the day when they were first invented, but eventually the game mechanics was changed so that players could actually make their moves simultaneously. Now, now we have clarified a couple of, types of games, and of course there are so many more. I could spend weeks just trying to lay out ontologies related to gaming, and that of course is futile, because if I come up with sort of a description of what constitutes the area of gaming, you may come up with a completely different one, and both of us might be right. It's very difficult to come up with taxonomies or ontologies that cover every aspect and do so in a generally acceptable way, right? So let's keep it at that. We know about perfect, imperfect information and complete information, turn-based simultaneously. That's all we need for now. So then let's look into the idea of a configuration. A configuration is an instantiation of all game entities, whatever that is, and their attributes, whatever that is. So what is a game entity? I define it, this is my point of view, I define it as a constituent part or component of a game. Different games have different components. Here are examples. A player is a constituent part of a game. Without a player, probably there's no game. And typically, you need at least one human player. If you're playing against a computer, the other player is simulated by the computer or the other players. But again, they are constituent parts of the game. If it's a multiplayer game, then several players are constituent parts of the game. Human players, computer-controlled players. They are necessary to play games. A deck of cards. If you're playing a card game, then the cards are necessary to play the game. Right? They make up the game. They're a constituent part of the game. A board, as in chess or checkers, or backgammon, or whatever. But of course, when we're talking about computer games, then we are not bound to physical objects that could be a simulated 2D or 3D game world. But the world in which the game takes place is a constituent part, the game entity of the game. Well, in computer games, we know there are items we may use. I don't know, first-person shooters wouldn't be first-person shooters without weapons, right? Role-playing games wouldn't probably be role-playing games without the idea of swords to slay dragons or ogres, whatever. There are things we can use. They are not always available at every time throughout the game, but they are constituent parts of the game. When these physical games are like games played in the real world, chess, backgammon, whatever, we have pieces to move, cards to draw, constituent parts of the game. Random generators are also constituent parts of the game. Sometimes we have to roll a dice, or 2 or 3 or whatever. Or in a computer game, there might be some inbuilt random generator which we not actively see, but which is there anyway. Without it, the game would be different. So random generation is sometimes a constituent component of a game. And of course, so many more, so many more. Okay, then what are these attributes? I said a game, consists of entities and their attributes. So a game entity attribute is an aspect of a game entity. What could that be? A set of cards in my hand while playing poker. I am a player and thus a constituent part of the game, but my sort of current state as an entity in the game is attributed by the value of the cards I hold in my hands. This sort of distinguishes me from the other participants of the game. They are also game entities, but they have different attributes because they're holding different cards. Yeah, in computer games, an attribute could be the location of your game character in the game world. and that will change every sort of step in time. But it is a defining aspect of your game character. It is an attribute where your character is in the game at some point in time. Location is typically not enough. If we're talking about these games that take place in physically simulated complex worlds, you're not just located, but you're constantly on the move. So your state of motion is defined by where you are and where you are heading. It's actually typically in 3D worlds, a 6-dimensional state vector. So you have location and velocity. Yeah, in-game items have locations as well. Is an attribute. You want to find some treasure. It is located somewhere. This location is an attribute of the treasure, which is an entity of the game. Or you want to get some armor or whatever, or some other items. Of course, as a player, you may have an inventory, a list of items currently at your disposal. Right? That might be a very long list because you've been playing a game for a long time, you have collected many things throughout playing the game, or it might be a very short list, but it is a list of stuff you can use as a player. It's an attribute of your game character. Health, armor, ammunition, stuff like that define your character. Will you survive an upcoming battle against a dragon? Is probably a question of your current health status. And depending on that attribute, the decision you are going to make within the game, may be varying. Then of course, these very elementary things like, is the character alive or dead? Is an item available or unavailable? These sort of binary variables are also game entity attributes. And I could continue this list forever. Let's keep it at that, right? So we have game entities and we have attributes that define the current sort of state of that entity. Now, I said a configuration is an instantiation of the game world and all the game entities and their attributes. Right. How many possible configurations are there? Let's have a look. So in the exercises, you're supposed to work with tic-tac-toe. And in the second project, you'll actually have to calculate something. Not this number, though. But this is just to give you an idea as to how these numbers can be calculated. So we have tic-tac-toe. It's being played on a 3x3 board. So there are 9 fields. Every field can be empty. It can be occupied by the player that uses crosses, or it can be occupied by the player that uses the noughts. Right? So 9 fields. Every field can have 3 possible values or states. So we have 3 raised to the 9 possible configurations. This is 19,683 configurations. For tic-tac-toe, this is seriously the simplest game we will ever discuss throughout the whole semester. But even there, numbers get quite large. What about Connect 4? In another task, or in several other tasks in the projects, you'll have to deal with Connect 4. This is typically played on a 6x7 grid. Again, every of these locations in the grid can have 3 statuses. Could be empty, could be player 1 or player 2 who has occupied that location within this Connect 4 grid. So we have 3 raised to the power of 42. But this is a considerably larger number. Let's say it's 1.1 times 10 to the 20th. And Connect 4 is seriously, it's Connect 4. So then what about chess? It's played on an 8x8 board. 32 pieces. 16 for the player white, 16 for the player black. We do the same sort of simple combinatorics and we find 32 raised to the power of 64. 2.1 times 10 raised to the 96th power. And here's go. 19 by 19 board. 2 players, so again 3 possible states for every field on a go board. So we have 3 raised to the power of 19 by 19, which is 361. We find 1.7 times 19, of course, just rough estimates, 1.7 times 10 raised to the power of 172. Here's the number of possible configurations in a modern sort of video game. In a modern video game, states are not really discrete anymore. Right? On these board games, we have the board, we have fields on the board. Every field on the board can be attributed. We have a number of different attributes, typically 3 for these board games, so we can do the combinatorics. But in video games, there is nothing we can do. Right? For all intents and purposes, there are infinitely many configurations. And here's the number of atoms in the known universe. This is of course also a number that is rather impossible to pinpoint, but it is being estimated to be between 10 to the 78 or 10 to the 82, depending on how you. Interesting, it's 4 orders of magnitude. You would say, well, these numbers are rather similar. They are not. They are not. These are like considerably different numbers, and we don't know which one is closer to the truth. But what we can say is that the estimated number of atoms in the universe, is not even close to the number of configurations of chess or Go states. But we have to be careful with these numbers. We have to be careful. For instance, in chess, I said, well, there is like 64 fields on the board, and there are 32 pieces. So every field can be in one of 3 states. It can have one of 3 attributes. And so I happily raised 3 to the power of 64. But only at max 32 out of these 64 fields can actually be occupied. There are not more pieces to move than 32. So our estimate was a bit generous. Let's try to come up with a more sensible one. How many numbers or ways are there to select 32 fields out of 64? Right. These are things, I hope, that are known to each and everyone. We call it 46 choose 32. It's written like this, and the meaning of this is we have 46 factorial over 32 factorial times 46 minus 32 factorial. This is 46 choose 32. Or n choose k, I would have n factorial times k factorial over k factorial times n minus k factorial. Well, interestingly, 64 minus 32 is exactly 32, so we have 64 factorial over 32 factorial times 32 factorial. This is the number of possible choices of 32 fields out of 64 fields on the chessboard. Now we have chosen 32 fields, and we have 32 pieces to position on these fields. And there are, of course, 32 factorial ways of positioning 32 things in 32 pinholes. And that is, we have to multiply this number by 32 factorial, which is nice, because one of those cancels out. And we now find 4.8 times 10 to the 53. This is considerably less than 10 to the 96. Right? And still, this is a very rough estimate. Right? Because what we didn't do is think about situations where there are less than 32 pieces on the board. Right? Not in every possible state throughout the game of chess, there will be 32 pieces on the board. Might be considerably fewer. Well, how to figure out how many positions in chess there are? These are questions that are dealt with, which is by a field that is called combinatorial game theory, or CGT. CGT is, well, it's an area of mathematics. Might be some computer science scientists in there, but you know, this is for the mathematicians to play with. It's actually focused on turn-based games, such as chess, Go, checkers, whatever, two-player games, perfect information, and it focuses on theoretical results rather than on algorithms for how to play these games. Theoretical results such as what is the complexity of the game, or does the game have a solution? And what that means will become clearer much later on. Very interesting field if you're into theory. For instance, within CGT, they invented the concept of surreal numbers. Surreal numbers. Yeah. They're there. In this 1950 paper written by Shannon, which I mentioned last time, he sort of laid the foundation for this field of combinatorial game theory. And he came up with an estimate of the number of possible chess positions, which is, again, much smaller than the one we just did. But still, this one is you know, very, very optimistic, because this number does contain lots of configurations that can never occur within a game of chess. So that leads us to the concept of first state space, which is used to refer to all possible configurations of a game. That is the state space. And we've seen that, you know, depending on how we estimate the size, it can be very large or not quite as large, but still very large. That is the state space of a game. But not on all configurations are valid, right? And this then leads to the definition of a game state. And I know it's beginning to become confusing. Well, configuration, state space, game state, it's like that. I hate it myself. When I was preparing this lecture series and, you know, reading these elementary stuff of game theory, like, I think, why did they call it like this? And now they use this term here, but they do, right? So I was facing the choice if I introduce my own terminology, which is not probably quite so confusing, or use the one that is established, and of course that is better for you. So yeah, we have to live with the fact that there's a configuration, but the set of all configurations is called state space. But a game state is just the configuration that is valid. That is, it is a configuration that complies with the rules of the mechanics or the physics of the game. And again, not all configurations are game states. Here is a configuration of Connect 4 that is indeed a game state. This can happen within the game. And here is an example of a configuration that is not a game state. Because this could never happen. This coin here will always fall down. So it's impossible for this coin to reside up here if there aren't any other coins below it. Immediately below it. Right? And in our rough estimates, we included these situations. So basically, we estimated the size of the state space, and thus included lots of configurations that are not game states. Sorry about the terminology. Since we are computer scientists and we like to, you know, get hands-on experience with games and we like to program them, we have to ask ourselves, okay, that's cool, we have a certain games, we know its rules, so we could probably implement it on a computer. How would we do that? And that leads us to the question of how to represent a game state, or to defining a game state representation. And a game state representation is a mathematical model or computer implementation of a game state. And here is an example. This is a game state within the game of tic-tac-toe. It is a valid configuration, that is what is a game state. This can happen if you play tic-tac-toe. It is not a configuration that could never happen. A configuration that could never happen would be if all the fields were occupied by crosses. This is a situation that was included in our estimate, but can never happen throughout a game of tic-tac-toe. This is a game state. And there are three ideas of how to represent it. Well, we know tic-tac-toe is being played by two players. We have to represent that somehow. Right? We know basically the game state of tic-tac-toe is bound to the board. If we have a representation of what's going on the board, we know everything about tic-tac-toe. So we have two players. They have occupied fields on the board. So why not just list the fields occupied by player 1 and the fields occupied by player 2. And there we go. Right? We list them, and that is a interesting, valid, probably useful representation of that game state. If you have looked at the code I provide online, you will recognize this second idea. Here I am representing the game state as a 3x3 matrix whose entries are either +1, -1, or 0. And obviously, in this matrix, I am using an entry of 1 to refer to the player who is, marking the crosses, and a -1 to the player using the noughts, and a 0, to refer to the empty fields, obviously. Right? If you have looked at the code I provide, you realize, oh, this is actually a very interesting way of doing it, because with NumPy we can then very elegantly compute important facts about the game state. Right? But there are infinitely many other ways of representing these game states. This is a 9x9 board, so it's something that is of size 9. It's a 3x3 board, something of a size 9. Right? There are sort of 9 fields in here. We can pretend these fields to be a row vector. Right? I basically take the first row and stack the second row, or concatenate the second row, and then concatenate the third row. And it gives me a 9-dimensional row vector. And then within this row vector, I am now using a digit of 1 to indicate a dimension in that vector that is occupied by player 1. I'm using a 2 to indicate a dimension in that vector that is occupied by player 2, and a 0 to indicate empty fields. Makes sense, right? Interestingly, this 9-dimensional vector can also be expressed at that number. How did I do that? Why would I tell you that this 9-dimensional vector corresponds to a certain natural number? Let's ever so briefly digress and look into the idea of positional numeral systems. So here is a number. It is called 157. And if we look at numbers like that, we don't even think about it anymore. But what we actually do, what this number actually means, is a quantity where we have 7 times 10 raised to the power of 0, plus 5 times 10 raised to the power of 1, plus 1 times 10 raised to the power of 2. That is 7 times 1, plus 5 times 10, plus 1 times 100. Right? This is the decimal system we also used to, and if we compute this, well, the result is indeed 157. Yay! Now, do you know this number system, numeral system? It works the same way. I have an 8-digit number here, and let's compute it beginning at the last digit, so it's 1 times 2 raised to the 0 plus 1 times 2 squared is this one here. I don't include the positions where there's a 0 here. So this is 1 times 2 squared plus 1 times 2 cubed plus 1 times 2 to the 4th, 2 zeros here, and then there is 1 times 2 to the 7. What is the result? Very good. All right, what else do we have? We could do it in base 16. It's called hexadecimal numbers. We have 9D, and that's computed beginning at the last digit. So this is D, which represents the number 13, times 16 raised to the 0, plus 9 times 16 raised to the 1. The result is 157. All right. Now, then what did I do on the previous slide? I was considering base 3. All right. So I had a number, or a string of digits, with digits were between 0, 1, or 2. And let's compute this. So this is 0 times 3 to the 0, plus 1 times 3, plus 2 times 3 squared, plus 2 times 3 cubed, plus 3 to the 4th. What is this? Not so fast. How could you have told me, how could you have known that this cannot be 157?
The last one.
Yeah, all right, but do you have a better argument? There are lots of base 3 numbers where the last one is 0. So 157 is odd, right? Every power of 3 is odd, right? But if we have 2 times an odd number, it's an even number. If we add an odd number to an odd number, it's an even number. So we have 2 even numbers, 2 odd numbers. That is that this number, whatever, it has to be even. And thus it cannot be 157. All right? So yeah, I might play with you, fool you, try to provoke your minds. Okay, interestingly, every binary digit is called a bit, and for those of you who didn't know it, every ternary digit is called a trit. Right? And even though we might not be really familiar with this idea of ternary numbers, we have just seen that for the context of turn-based 2-player games, they may come in handy. Right? Because obviously, I mean, there are many different ways of doing it, but we can always come up with a way of defining a bijection that maps game states in these types of games to natural numbers. Right? Depends on sort of if we sort of identify the top left corner of the board with the 0 power position in the number string, or the bottom right, whatever that. There are different ways, but we can always come up with an encoding where a game state is mapped to a number, and that is onto 1 to 1. Right? We can always, for every game state, if we fix the function, there is a number, and for this number there's only one game state, and vice versa. And this may come in very handy when we would do that seriously, like for really demanding games where we have to resort to lookup tables and stuff. We can sort of come up with hash codes for game states. Okay, from now on I will drop the distinction between game state and game state representation. I don't really care about how we implement it anymore. It doesn't matter. Now we'll sort of discuss this more from a theoretical point of view. No distinction between game states and game state representation. Then we have to think about the notion of a move. What is a move? A move is a function of 2 arguments. The first argument is a game state, or game state. The second argument is an action. So this is a function that maps from the Cartesian product of game states and actions to game states. In the literature, and I don't know if you're reading AI books on games, you will quite frequently find the notion of apply. Apply is a half move in a turn-based game. So I'm not going to use that term. Right? Apply would be in chess player white moves, that's apply. Player back moves, it's another apply. Two plies make one move. I'm not using that. You know, to me, every half move is a move. And also a transposition, something else you might read quite frequently in the literature, is understood to be a series of moves. I may use that word from time to time, but I guess not. Then, what is a game tree? I guess everybody knows that, right? Or has seen game trees already, at least I hope. I hope that this is not your first lecture on AI ever. But let's be sure. A game tree is a directed graph whose nodes are game states, and again we recall that game states are valid configurations, and whose edges are moves. And this is good because that guarantees that the nodes are valid configurations, because if we are in one game state and all the players comply with the rules of the games and make their moves, then the game state and the move will lead to another game state and not to a configuration that could never occur within the constraints of the game. Here is a game tree for tic-tac-toe. And you might be wondering why we start so far down in the game. Right? This is a game state where 5 out of 9 fields are already occupied. The answer is, I can plot this one, and we can still see something. So this is a game state, right? Because it's a game tree. Because when I defined game tree, I never said it has to start at the initial position of the game. Didn't say that. So it's a game tree, and this one starts, you know, at some point, somewhere during a game of tic-tac-toe. You can try that at home. And actually, in the next project 2, you are asked to do it, to compute the complete game tree. And while you're at it, you can try to plot it, and you will see where that leads you. So this, you know, the complete game tree for tic-tac-toe can be huge. So let's start here. This is a game state, obviously, and there are 4 open fields. So that's to say, apparently, the player 0 or player 2 is about to move, because in this state there are 3 fields occupied by player 1 and just 2 fields occupied by player 2. So just from looking at that state, we can deduce it must be player 2's move. Right? So player 2 is to move. What could he or she do? There are 4 open fields, 4 alternatives for placing the next node. Right? The best idea would, of course, be to go here, because then what has happened? A winning situation. Right? We would have, or player 2 would have reached a leaf of the game tree, even though this leaf is fairly high up in the tree. But it's a leaf, because there the game ends. Right. But player 2 may not see this opportunity and, you know, mark another field. Then the game will continue, because then player 1 still has, you know, ways to move, but there are only 3 free fields left. So that is, there are 3 moves for player 1. And then player 1 makes a move, and then player 2 is to move again. And this time there's only like 2 possible alternatives, so the branching, you know, goes down to 2. And then eventually there's just 1 field left, and whatever player is to move then has to move to that field. I actually didn't count the number of nodes here, But yeah, it's too much for me to cut it right now. And seriously, we started fairly far down in the game here. But every edge, once again, is a move. Because, well, if we make this move, we end up in this state. Is a valid configuration. So this makes sense, right? Tic-tac-toe game tree started fairly far down. I already mentioned it. There are complete trees, complete game trees. Those are the game trees that start at the root, or whose root node is the initial start configuration state of the game. For tic-tac-toe, that would be the situation where the whole board is empty. And then this complete tree not only contains the initial state, but every other possible state that could be reached from the initial state. And you will have to compute the number of states. It's not that big, but it's not that small either. You will figure it out. Yeah, I hate this terminology. The state space complexity is the number of game states reachable from the initial state. Or we could say the number of nodes in a complete game tree. This is exactly the same, right? Because we said the game tree is, the complete game tree is that game tree that includes every possible game state. And now we say the state space complexity is the number of possible game states, not configurations. And so therefore the state space complexity is just the number of nodes in a complete game tree. The game tree size, however, is the number of games that can be played. Do not ask me why it's called the game tree size, because this is the number of leaf nodes in the complete game tree. Why is sort of the size of the game tree called the state space complexity, and the number of leaf nodes is called the game tree size? I have no idea. But I have to live with it. Sorry about that. To make it clear, we have to accept the fact that a state space is not a complete game tree, because the state space is the number of all configurations. And the state space size is not the state space complexity. The state space complexity is the number of possible of game states. Right? But the state space size is the size of the configuration space. I hate it, but it's like that. So don't be surprised if I might, throughout the things that are to come, confuse these things. You better get used to it right now. It may happen. We saw, however, that this is fairly easy at least to estimate. Right? Some combinatorial considerations, and we come up with upper bounds for the state space size. Right? For tic-tac-toe, 3 raised to the power of 9. Computing the size of the game tree is a different beast. Is a different beast because seriously nobody knows how many valid configurations there are in chess or in Go. For checkers it had been done just recently, 2007, after 18 years of computation time. So checkers is solved. We know how many states there are in checkers, but for chess or even Go, nobody knows. We don't know. Right? We can easily estimate these numbers, but there will be lots of configurations included that are not game states. And you know, really pinpointing all the game states, the valid configurations, is a totally different beast. It's indeed stuff humankind does not know. We don't know how many game states there are in chess. So this is what we have learned today. We know the notion of an incomplete information game. We have seen the notion of an imperfect information game. We have seen the ideas of game entities and entity attributes. We saw the idea of a configuration and the state space, which is not related to the game state. But we saw that a game state is a valid configuration. We saw that a move is something that takes a game state as input plus an action that complies with the rules of the game and produces a new game state. And we have seen the notion of game trees. And I will stop at this point today because it's not enough time to start something serious, and it would be way too boring to continue with all these definitions. So, are there any questions? Yeah?
The perfect information systems, it's about the events, right?
The
All
events?
Previous events are, the user has no other.
Yeah, so you know everything at this point in time and everything that led there.
And imperfect is about actions.
Imperfect is, you may know about the current situation, but there might have been different ways that could have led there, depending on what kind of cards a player has and has played, right? So you cannot be entirely sure about what happened previously or why it happened. And what's more critical is that you do not really know everything about the current situation. For instance, in the game of poker, you can see your cards, your hand. You can see the cards that have already been played, but not the others. Well, you have also some information as to how much money they have bet. And you can probably deduce from there if they have a good hand or not and whatever. So you have to, you know, it's like lots of uncertainty going on. Lots of uncertainty.
How are events related to actions?
Events?
Is there any relationship between events and actions?
What is an event?
The valid state of the game.
Yeah, so I talked about configurations and states. I never mentioned events. So I don't know what you mean by event.
The perfect information system
Yeah.
has, the user has to know all the events that has occurred before.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it's just the sequence of moves, if you will, right? Or a snapshot of all the game states that happened previously. I mean, if you can keep them all in your head, you're good. And if you're a bridge player, and you played on a professional level, you actually have to memorize a lot, and that distinguishes experts from hobbyists. But yeah, the most crucial distinction is that in these imperfect information games, you are not entirely aware of what's available to your opponent. The difference between chess, checkers, Go, backgammon, whatever, and poker, bridge, whatever. Battleship. Some things are hidden from you. Any other questions? Yeah.
What was the difference between a status space and concrete game tree? Just for
Yeah. No. I mean, like the state space, I don't really know why they... see, state space is the set of all configurations. And we have seen that there are configurations. This is a configuration, but it's not a game state. Right? But the game tree only contains game states. And please, seriously, do not ask me why the set of configurations is called state space, because it contains stuff that is not a state, like this. This is a configuration but not a state. This is a configuration that is a state. Yeah. I hate that. Sorry about it. Any other questions? Great, then there's a holiday coming up on Monday. We'll see each other again next Thursday. See ya.